For 4 years, I woke up every single morning, and the first thought that hit me before I even opened my eyes was my son's name. And then the brother I hadn't spoken to in 15 years pulled into my driveway in a car that cost more than my house, and said 4 words that changed everything. "Welcome to Dad's true emotions." I want you to understand something about grief that nobody puts in the brochure. It is not loud. It is not dramatic. It does not arrive in one devastating wave that you survive and then recover from. It is quiet. It is patient. It is the kind of thing that moves in slowly, the way water gets into the foundation of an old house, and by the time you realize the damage, the walls are already leaning. That was my life for 4 years. My name is Dennis Carver. I am 53 years old. I live in a 2-bedroom house on the edge of a small town in northern Ontario called Ferris Creek, the kind of place that exists on maps mostly as a reference point for somewhere else. I used to be a high school math teacher. I used to have a wife named Ruth who made terrible soup and somehow convinced herself it was a gift she had. I used to have a son named Connor who was 16 years old, academically gifted, painfully competitive at everything he tried, and absolutely, catastrophically bad at rock climbing, which he refused to admit and refused to stop doing. That last part matters, remember it. It was a school outdoor education weekend up at Ridgemont Park. 31 students, 3 staff chaperones, 1 granite cliff face, and somewhere between the morning session and the lunch break, Connor Carver stopped existing in any way I could find. No note, no goodbye, no witness who saw anything they were willing to put in writing. Just a rope anchor still fixed to the cliff wall, a water bottle on its side at the base of the North Trail, and a park ranger who went from helpful to uncomfortable to entirely unavailable over the course of about 48 hours. I remember standing in the ranger station, talking to the lead search coordinator, a man named Prentice who had the practiced calm of someone who delivered bad news for a living. He told me the terrain was unforgiving. He told me conditions had made extended searching impossible. He told me they had done everything they could. I told him to do more. He didn't. So I did it myself. That is the only thing a father can do when the system decides it is finished with his son. You take the wheel. You keep driving. The first year was private investigators, 2 of them. The first one charged me 3 months of salary to produce a report I could have written myself from the public search records. The second one was better, more tenacious, more honest, and told me at the end of 6 months that she had hit a wall she couldn't see over and couldn't get around. I believed her. I fired her anyway because firing her meant I had to find someone else to keep looking. And finding someone else to keep looking meant I was still moving. And as long as I was still moving, I was still a father searching for his son, and not just a man sitting in the wreckage of the life he used to have. By year 2, I had spent everything. My savings, the emergency fund Ruth and I had built over 20 years of careful living, a loan from my colleague at the school, a quiet man named Bernard Osai, who handed me the money in an envelope and told me he didn't want to discuss terms because there were no terms. "Just take it," he said. That man will never fully understand what those words did to me. By year 3, the Facebook group I'd started for Connor had gone quiet. The journalists who'd picked up the story in the first few months had moved on to newer grief. The leads had dried. The printed maps and the highlighted documents and the cold coffee cups that were always on my kitchen table had stopped representing progress and started representing something I didn't want to name. I knew I wasn't well. I had enough of my rational mind left to know that. I just couldn't make myself care enough to do anything about it. And that is where this story really starts. It was a Thursday in March. I know because I'd just come back from the school where I still technically worked 3 days a week, because Bernard had quietly arranged for me to keep my position during what everyone politely called my extended difficult period. I was standing in my driveway arguing with my car, which had not started on the first attempt in about 6 months, and which I was addressing in language that would have gotten a student sent to the principal's office. I heard a vehicle come slowly up the road, slow in a deliberate way, the way someone drives when they've been planning this moment longer than the drive itself. I assumed it was Bernard with food I hadn't asked for. He did that sometimes. Left things on the porch and drove away before I could refuse them. So without turning around, I called out over my shoulder, "Just leave it on the step." A car door opened, footsteps on the wet gravel, and then a voice I had not heard in 15 years said, quietly, still arguing with machinery I see. I turned around so fast, I stepped off the edge of the driveway and nearly went into the hedge. My brother Thomas was standing beside a dark silver Mercedes that had absolutely no business being on a residential street in Ferris Creek. He was in a long wool coat, hands in his pockets, the same square jaw I saw in my own mirror every morning, but better rested and considerably better dressed. He looked like time and money had been kind to him. He also looked like a man who had rehearsed this moment many times and was still not entirely confident about how it was going to land. He was right to be uncertain. Thomas Carver and I had not spoken since our mother's funeral 15 years ago. At that funeral, in the parking lot of the reception hall afterward, we had said things to each other that don't unsay themselves. Grieving men in parking lots rarely produce their finest diplomatic work. We had said what we said, and then we had simply stopped. No dramatic falling out, no lawyers, no ultimatums. Just a slow, mutual fade into separate lives, which is sometimes worse than a clean break because there is no specific moment to point to, no wound to properly close. I straightened up and looked at my brother across 15 years of silence and said, "You've got some nerve." He said, "I know." I said, "15 years, Thomas." He said, "I know, Dennis, I know." And then, before I could say anything else, before I could reach into all of the things I had been saving up for exactly this hypothetical moment when I would finally say them to his face, he said 4 words that reached into my chest and stopped everything. He said, "I know where Connor is." Let me tell you something about that moment because I want to get it right. The world did not stop. That's the thing nobody tells you about the moment you've been praying for through 4 years of sleepless nights. The world keeps going completely indifferently. A dog barked somewhere on the next street. The wind moved through the trees at the end of my road. A delivery truck went past without slowing. Everything continued, relentless and ordinary. But I stopped. Every single part of me went completely still. And I looked at my brother's face, and I knew with a certainty I cannot explain that he was not lying. Thomas had never been a liar. Whatever else I could say about him, whatever had been said in that parking lot 15 years ago, the man did not fabricate. He was constitutionally incapable of it, which had always been both his best quality and the quality that made him most difficult to be around, because truth delivered without softening is not always comfortable to receive. He was not lying now. I could see it in the way he was standing. Not light, not hopeful, not excited the way a person looks when they're delivering good news. Heavy, like whatever he knew had been pressing down on him for a while and had not been getting easier to carry. I took a breath, then I looked down at my feet, then I looked back at him. I said, "Give me 2 minutes to put proper shoes on." He said, "Take 3, we have a long drive." I went inside. I put on my boots and my jacket. I took the photograph of Connor from the kitchen counter where it had lived for 4 years, his 16th birthday, grinning the way only a 16-year-old who thinks he owns the world can grin, his climbing gear over one shoulder, completely unbothered. I put it in the inside pocket of my jacket, directly over my chest, and I walked back outside and got into my brother's Mercedes. Whatever was at the end of this road, I had been waiting 4 years for it. There is a specific kind of silence between 2 brothers who have not spoken in 15 years. It is not the comfortable silence of people who know each other too well to need words. It is the silence that has history in it. It has furniture in it, Old arguments and old choices and things said in parking lots that drift around the car like smoke. It fills the space between you until breathing requires conscious effort. We drove for 20 minutes without speaking. I watched the Ontario landscape move past the window, bare trees, gray sky, roads still carrying the last of the winter grit, and I let the silence be what it was. Then, without turning from the window, I said, "How long have you known?" His jaw tightened. I saw it in the passenger side mirror. "Thomas," I said. He exhaled slowly. 7 months, he said. I turned and looked at him. 7 months. You have known for 7 months, and this is the first. He said, I needed to be sure. Everything I found, every piece of it, I needed to verify before I came to you. Because if I showed up with half a picture and you went running at it before it was solid, people would have seen you coming, and Connor would have paid for that. That last word landed like something thrown. Connor. The name in his mouth after 4 years of only ever hearing it in my own head. I turned back to the window. Tell me everything, I said. From the very beginning, don't skip anything. Thomas was a forensic financial auditor. He worked for a private firm contracted by various government and semi-government bodies to examine procurement irregularities in large-scale contracting. For 15 years, while I had been losing everything in Ferris Creek, my brother had been quietly moving through the kind of corridors where serious money got moved around, and the people moving it preferred not to be watched too closely. 7 months ago, he had been assigned to audit an organization called Helix Meridian Group. On paper, a private contractor managing wilderness skills development programs for several federal agencies, off-grid training facilities, survival and endurance curriculum, logistics support for field-based government programs. The kind of organization that was real enough to have offices and contracts and procurement records, but vague enough in its actual mandate that asking too many specific questions produced only more general answers. He started pulling their financials, he said, and something didn't add up. 3 registered facilities, all mountainous, all remote, all operating under program classification codes that didn't link to any publicly named or acknowledged agency. One of those facilities was 14 kilometers northeast of Ridgemont Park. I pressed my hand flat against the car door. The metal was cold through my palm. "Keep going," I said. He had started digging carefully, he said. The way you dig when you're not sure what's underneath you and you don't want to disturb it before you know what it is. What he found, buried under shell companies and classified procurement layers and several rounds of redacted federal filing, was a program called Sentinel. On paper, Sentinel was a long-term field preparedness initiative, training a small cohort of exceptional young people for sustained operations in remote and extreme environments, the kind of work that required people who were physically capable, mentally resilient, and critically, he said, and his voice went flat when he said it, people without strong family anchors, people nobody would spend years looking for. Someone inside Sentinel, at some point, had stopped waiting for willing participants and started selecting them. Young people, mostly teenagers, athletes, high academic performers, people with documented problem-solving capability and physical endurance. They identified candidates through school performance registries, sports competition records, outdoor education program participation logs. A rock climbing weekend, I said. My own voice sounded like it was coming from a room away. Thomas nodded, both hands steady on the wheel. Connor's school had registered the Ridgemont Park trip with the Provincial Outdoor Education Board 8 weeks before it happened. His academic standing was in the Provincial Gifted Learner Registry. His regional competition results in orienteering were publicly listed. He paused. Dennis, they didn't take Connor because he was in the wrong place. They chose Connor, months before that trip ever happened. I put my forehead against the cold window glass and sat there for a while without speaking. He's alive, I said. I didn't ask it. I couldn't afford for it to be a question. He's alive, Thomas said. I have seen a photograph. I want to be honest with you. I'm not a man who cries in front of people. I have cried alone in my car late at night in the particular privacy of a man who has no one left he feels comfortable falling apart in front of. I did not cry in that car, but it was the closest I had come to the moments in my car in a very long time. I kept my forehead against the window and I looked at the road going past, and I let myself privately, entirely, feel what those 3 words meant. He's alive. Then I sat up straight. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand before Thomas could confirm what he'd already almost certainly seen. And I said, "Where is he, and what do we need to do?" The Sentinel facility was in a remote section of northern Quebec, operating behind a registered land holding for a forestry research company that did not, in any meaningful sense, conduct forestry research. 400 acres of boreal forest, 1 monitored access road, 7 structures across the compound, and a staff of 19 people, 12 of them operational security. Thomas had a contact on the inside, a woman named Dr. Adiz Okonkwo, a behavioral psychologist who had been brought into Sentinel at its founding to monitor recruit psychological adaptation. She had been watching the program drift from its original stated purpose for 3 years and had reached, quietly and carefully, the point where she was no longer comfortable staying silent about where it had gone. She had contacted Thomas through a professional back channel 6 months ago. She had been feeding him documentation since. I asked why. Why would she risk that? Thomas was quiet for a moment. Because Connor has never adapted, he said. 4 years in and he still asks about home, still talks about his father. They have tried everything they use: conditioning, isolation, identity restructuring. He has been resistant from the beginning, and the man who runs the facility, a former military intelligence operative named Warren Stahl, has run out of tolerance for resistance. What does that mean? I said. What happens when Stahl runs out of tolerance? Thomas didn't answer immediately. The road went under us. The sky outside was getting heavier, the particular gray of a sky deciding whether to snow. Thomas, I said. They don't retain people who won't commit to the program, he said carefully. They consider it an operational liability. Adiz told me they've given Connor a window. 60 days from when she first made contact with me. After that, he is reclassified. Reclassified, I said. That is a very smooth word for something that sounds like it has very sharp edges. Yes, Thomas said, it is. I exhaled through my nose and looked at the road ahead. How many days are left? I said. 38, he said. I nodded slowly. Then I said, where are we going right now today, this car? A hotel in Timmins. Dr. Okonkwo is meeting us there this evening. She left the facility 4 days ago on approved personal leave. She has 1 week before her absence becomes conspicuous. So she's the plan, I said. She's the beginning of the plan, Thomas said. She knows the layout, the schedule rotations, the security patterns, the location of every blind spot in that compound. She knows exactly where Connor is housed and what his day looks like hour by hour. He paused. She also knows what she's been collecting for 6 months. What do you mean? I said. I mean she didn't just contact me to help one man get his son back, Thomas said. I mean she came with documentation. I mean she has been building something. I looked at my brother. Really looked at him, the way I hadn't been able to yet, taking in the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there at our mother's funeral, the gray at his temples, the particular set of his shoulders that I recognized as the same set our father's shoulders had when he was carrying something and refusing to show it. I said, why did you come to me? You could have taken what Adiz gave you to authorities, to a journalist, to someone with actual institutional power to do something with it. Why drive all the way to Ferris Creek and collect what's left of your brother? The road hummed under the wheels. Thomas was quiet for long enough that I thought maybe he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, because he's not my son, Dennis, and this was never mine to fix on my own. He paused, but he is my nephew. And I spent 15 years being the kind of man who stays out of things that cost something. His voice shifted, something in it that sounded like it had been waiting a long time for exactly this road to say itself on. I'm finished being that man. I didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. But somewhere on that highway between Ferris Creek and Timmins, 15 years of silence quietly folded itself up and moved out of the space between us. We had 38 days. We had a woman on the inside who had spent 6 months building something. We had each other. And we had Connor, still fighting after 4 years, still asking about home, still waiting. I was coming. Dr. Adiz Okonkwo was nothing like what I had imagined in the car. I don't know exactly what I'd imagined. Someone hesitant, maybe. Someone who needed convincing, who carried her guilt in her posture and needed permission to be brave. Adiz Okonkwo needed none of those things. She was composed and precise in the way that people are when they have made a decision that scares them and have decided to stand on it anyway. She shook my hand, looked me directly in the eye and said, "Your son has your forehead and your stubbornness. I want you to know that right away because you deserve it." I had to look at the hotel room ceiling for a moment. I said, "Thank you." She nodded and spread her documents across the bed. The Sentinel facility in northern Quebec, 400 acres, 1 access road with a guard rotation every 6 hours, 7 buildings, administrative, 2 residential barracks, a training facility, a medical unit, equipment storage, and a structure she referred to with a particular flatness in her voice as the compliance wing. That was where they put recruits who were struggling to accept the life they had been placed in. Connor had been in the compliance wing for 4 weeks. Warren Stahl. Adiz described him in clean, medical sentences that somehow made him sound more frightening than anger would have. Controlled, strategic, not a man who made operational errors easily. Running a staff of 19, 12 of them security. "How do we get inside?" Thomas said. "We don't use the road," Adiz said. She pointed to the eastern boundary of the hand-drawn facility map. "There is a maintenance corridor that runs along the tree line here. It is inspected every 48 hours. The last inspection was yesterday morning." She looked up. "We have a window of just under 47 hours. She showed us where Connor was housed in the compliance wing. Ground floor, eastern wall, exterior ventilation access panel. Not alarmed. The facility was built by people who were afraid of people getting out, she said. They never seriously considered anyone trying to get in. That was their mistake. We left Timmins at 4 in the morning. Thomas drove. Adiz navigated from the passenger seat with a calm that I tried to absorb through the back seat by proximity. I held Connor's photograph in my hands the entire drive, and I did not try to talk myself into being less afraid, because being afraid was honest, and I had spent 4 years trying to be something other than what I actually was, and I was done with that. We were through the maintenance corridor in less than 4 minutes. We crossed the compound to the compliance wing in the dark with Adiz counting our steps and reading the shadows like someone who had spent months memorizing exactly this. The ventilation panel was where she said it would be. Thomas had brought the right tools. He always was more practically prepared than me. Some things about brothers do not change. The panel came free. The interior corridor was narrow and smelled like industrial cleaner, and something underneath it that I couldn't name and didn't want to. First door, second door, third door. I put my hand flat against it. Took one breath. Pushed it open. The room was small and gray and lit by a thin parallelogram of light from a high, narrow window. A cot, a desk, a photograph someone had left face down on the desk that I didn't look at yet, and sitting on the edge of the cot, awake, because he had always slept light, even as a small child he had always woken at sounds, was my son. 20 years old now, broader than I remembered, jaw sharper, a scar along his right collarbone that hadn't been there before, his hair shorter, his eyes when they came up to the door the same eyes, the same specific alertness, that instant coming to readiness that had always been in him, that I had watched develop from the time he was 4 years old and heard a strange noise in the hallway and came to investigate instead of pulling the covers over his head. He was always brave. Before they ever got their hands on him, he was already brave. He looked at me. I looked at him. 4 years of driving and searching and borrowing money and sleeping in my clothes and losing Ruth's emergency fund and Bernard's quiet envelope and cold coffee and dead ends collapsed into about 5 seconds of pure wordless reality. Then Connor said, in a voice that was deeper than I remembered and not quite as steady as he wanted it to be, "Dad." And I said, because I have apparently never in my life been capable of a graceful response to emotional situations, I said, "You're still wearing that same jacket." He didn't have the jacket on. It didn't matter. He broke first or I broke first. It happened at the same time and neither of us will ever agree on which. And I crossed that room and held my son, and the 4 years closed. We had 7 minutes. Connor moved fast, deliberate, like a person who had mentally rehearsed this moment, who had kept it alive somewhere inside him as a fact and not just a wish. He took nothing from that room. There was nothing in it worth carrying. We went back through the ventilation corridor, through the maintenance fence, through the tree line. We were 300 meters from the vehicle when the exterior lights of the facility snapped on behind us. Adi said, very calmly, "Run." We ran. Here is where I tell you about the justice, because you stayed for it, and it is the part of this story that matters most beyond the reunion itself. Adiz Okonkwo had not spent 6 months building documentation just to extract one boy from one room in one facility. She had spent 6 months building a case that could not be disputed, buried, or managed. Every internal communication she had access to. Every procurement record that linked Helix Meridian Group to federal funds being used for an unauthorized covert program. Every psychological assessment file, every compliance wing protocol document, every piece of paper that proved beyond any professional doubt that Sentinel had taken children, renamed them, conditioned them, and held them against their will inside a shell company's logging research station in the northern Quebec wilderness. That documentation went to 3 places the morning after we pulled Connor out. A federal investigator Thomas had been carefully cultivating for 2 years. An investigative journalist at a national outlet who covered government contractor misconduct and who had been looking for a story with exactly this kind of paper trail for 18 months. And a member of a parliamentary oversight committee who had been asking questions about Helix Meridian Group's procurement irregularities for over a year, and had been receiving the kind of politely obstructive non-answers that powerful organizations produce when they are very accustomed to not being seriously questioned. You cannot obstruct all 3 of those simultaneously. You cannot manage a federal investigation, a national news story, and a parliamentary inquiry at once. Not when the documents are already out there, already verified, already in multiple sets of hands that cannot be recalled. Within 60 hours of Connor walking out of that facility, Sentinel was the subject of a federal investigation. Within 4 weeks, the compound was raided. Warren Stahl was arrested on a Tuesday. Adiz sent me a message that morning. 2 words, "It's finished." The other young people inside that facility, 11 of them, were recovered and returned to their families. I will not describe those reunions because they are not mine to describe, but I kept their names. I still have that list, every single one of them. Helix Meridian Group was dissolved by court order the following year. Every executive who had signed off on Sentinel, every person who had sat in a boardroom and approved what they called a program and what I will call what it was, the deliberate disappearance of children, faced federal charges. The process was slow and administrative and entirely lacking in the dramatic satisfaction of movies. It was the kind of justice that takes 18 months and produces a great deal of paperwork and results in sentencing hearings rather than confrontations. It was permanent, that was enough. Thomas stayed for 3 weeks. On his last evening, we sat on the back step of my house, the two of us, with the kind of drink neither of us would normally buy and a silence that had, finally, lost all of its old furniture. Just two brothers sitting in the dark, watching the tree line, breathing the same cold Ontario air we'd breathed as kids in a house that no longer existed. At some point, Thomas said, "I should have come after the funeral. I should have come a long time before any of this happened." He said it to the trees, not to me, but I heard it. I looked at my brother, who had followed money trails into a federal conspiracy, who had driven a Mercedes up a gravel road in Ferris Creek, who had unscrewed a ventilation panel in the middle of the night in northern Quebec, who had given me back my son. I said, "You came when it was the only thing that mattered. That is not nothing, Thomas." He nodded. We sat there a while longer. Then he went back inside and I stayed on the step and looked at the night, and it was the first time in 4 years that the dark felt ordinary instead of enormous. A week later, I was in the driveway trying to explain to Connor why my car was making a sound it shouldn't be making, which was my way of spending time with him without making him feel like I was hovering, which he saw through immediately because he is smarter than me and always has been. He had his head under the hood, and without looking up he said, "You spent everything looking for me, didn't you?" I said, "Every last thing I had." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I knew you would. The whole time I was in there, whenever it was bad, that's the thing I came back to. I just kept thinking, he is still looking. He would not stop." I looked at my son standing in the driveway, 20 years old, with his whole life ahead of him and 4 years of someone else's plans behind him that he was already, stubbornly and quietly, in the process of making his own. And I thought about Bernard's envelope and Spencer's soup, and the years of cold coffee and the photograph I carried in my breast pocket. I said, "I want you to hear something and keep it, Connor. I want it to sit in you and stay there." He looked up from the engine. I said, "There is no version of this world where I stopped looking for you. There was never going to be a version where I stopped." He held my gaze for a long moment, and then the grin came. His mother's grin, honestly, the one he'd had since he was 2 years old, the one that meant he knew something you didn't and was choosing not to tell you just yet. The one that 4 years of Sentinel and Warren Stahl and compliance wing protocols had absolutely, completely, entirely failed to take from him. He handed me a wrench and said, "All right, then hold that and pay attention because I'm going to explain what's actually wrong with this car. Some things, it turns out, they cannot take. Some losses don't break you all at once. They do it slowly, patiently. But some things, when they come back, when they finally come back, they put you back together the same way, quietly, piece by piece, until one morning you reach for something solid and it's there, warm and real and exactly where it belongs." If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to Dad's True Emotions. Your support is what keeps these stories alive and what brings more of them to you. We are here every week with real, raw, deeply emotional stories about fathers, families, love, and the kind of courage that doesn't make the news but changes everything. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. And thank you for being part of this family.